Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. On October 9, 2010, in a small apartment on Hartford Street SE in Washington, D.C., the scene looked ordinary. A young mother was settling in for a quiet Saturday night. Two little boys and their 9-year-old cousin spread blankets and pillows across the living room floor for a promised sleepover. Cartoons, snacks, the kind of night kids remember for simple reasons. Her name was Unique Harris. 24. Recently moved. Single mother. No headlines, no record, no double life. Just a woman trying to stabilize a new chapter, care for her sons, stay close to her family, build something normal in a city that wasn't always safe but was supposed to be manageable if you kept your circle small. That night, her circle wasn't just the children. A man she'd known only a short time came by. Not a long-term partner. Not the father of her kids. Someone new, recent in her life. He arrived late. He was let in. The kids went to sleep. From the outside, nothing about that detail made the news yet. Inside that apartment, it would become the line investigators kept coming back to. What matters for this story is simple. By the time the sun came up, the only adults who should have been in control of that space were gone. Only the children remained. The next morning, the boys woke expecting cartoons and cereal. Their mother was not in the bedroom. Not on the couch. Nowhere in the unit. No note. No explanation. No sound of the shower, no clatter in the kitchen. For small children, confusion comes before fear. For adults, fear starts fast. The details that survived that morning would define the entire case. Her phone was missing. Her keys were missing. Those items matter in any missing person file, but two other objects mattered more. Her wallet stayed behind. So did her eyeglasses. People who knew Unique would tell police she needed those glasses. She didn't go anywhere important without them. For investigators, that's not drama, that's data. When someone walks away, they usually take the tools they actually use. There was no smashed door, no overturned furniture, no blood on the floor. On paper, it was the kind of scene that tempts people to say, maybe she left. But one piece of that room was wrong, the living room couch. A section of the cushion had been cut open, material removed. No good reason. No immediate explanation. It would not be fully understood for years, but it would become the first quiet indicator that this was not a voluntary disappearance. By the time family arrived, Unique was already a missing person. Not officially, not yet in the system, but in every way that counts. As you listen, ask yourself, how many of these details feel compatible with a young mother simply choosing to vanish? By the time officers stepped into the Hartford Street apartment, the sleepover was over and the room was quiet in the wrong way. 3 children were awake. One of them was old enough to say clearly what everyone would repeat for years: their mother had been there when they went to sleep and gone when they opened their eyes. No one reported shouting. No one reported a break-in. It looked, at first glance, like someone had simply stepped out and failed to come back. The walkthrough changed that. What investigators documented that morning became the backbone of this case. The front door was intact. There were no pry marks, no shattered frame, no sign of forced entry. That ruled out a certain kind of intruder. Inside, the apartment was not torn apart. No broken lamps, no overturned tables. The scene did not match a chaotic struggle. That mattered, not because it made things simpler, but because it narrowed what could have happened in a narrow window of time. Then came the details that did not line up with a voluntary exit. Unique Harris relied on her glasses. They were still inside. Her wallet, with identification and bank cards, was still inside. Those are anchor points in any missing adult case. People who decide to run tend to take the tools they need to function. Here, the basic tools stayed on the table. The items gone were different, her phone and her keys. Tools of access and communication, removed from the scene with her. If this was a choice, it was an odd one. If someone else was involved, those items were exactly what you would expect them to control. The children's description of the night added one more fixed point: there had been another adult present before they fell asleep. A man their mother knew, someone recent in her life, had been in that living room. To investigators, that did not immediately equal guilt. It did, however, define opportunity. In real cases, you do not start with theories about strangers in the dark when you have a confirmed adult inside a locked space before a disappearance. One element in the apartment drew attention even before laboratory work: the couch. A section of the cushion had been cut open and material taken out. Not worn, not torn, but cut. There was no simple domestic reason for it. No one on scene could give law enforcement a credible explanation. For a detective, that kind of damage is a marker. Something had been done to that couch on purpose, and it had been done near where the children were sleeping. When you strip away speculation and keep only what can be written into a report, the picture at the end of that first day is lean but hard to ignore. A young mother disappears inside her own apartment while her children sleep in the next room. No forced entry. No obvious violence. Essential identification left behind. Only one other adult confirmed in that space the night before she went missing. A cut piece of furniture no one can account for. From a distance, that might sound like a puzzle. Up close, it is a threat profile. It suggests that whatever happened was quiet, controlled, and carried out by someone who did not need to break in. In communities across the country, cases like this are reminders that harm often comes through the door you open yourself, not the lock a stranger breaks. As we move further into this story, every later breakthrough will trace back to this room. That is how solid case work functions: fixed points first, conclusions last. If you're watching this, think about what stands out to you already. Is there anything in this apartment that suggests a woman who simply walked away from her life? The first hours after a disappearance decide how seriously a case is treated. In this one, the file stopped looking routine almost immediately. Detectives started where they always do, with the people who knew the victim best. Family members described unique Harris in consistent terms. She was young, under pressure, figuring things out, but she was locked in on her sons. She called. She checked in. She did not disappear overnight without contacting someone. For investigators, that kind of pattern is not sentimental, it is baseline data. When a baseline is broken this sharply, you adjust your threat level. Next came the confirmation work. Officers checked local hospitals. No Jane Doe matching her description. Patrol units canvassed the surrounding blocks for any sign she had left on foot and run into trouble close by. Nothing. That absence of noise became its own signal. You expect at least some trail when an adult vanishes on her own. Here, the trail went dark at her front door. The focus turned quickly to the timeline inside the apartment. The children had gone to sleep while their mother was still there. Before that, a man she had been seeing for a short period had come over. He was older than her usual circle, not part of the long-standing family network that showed up that morning. In any missing person investigation, the last adults to see the victim are interviewed first. That's not drama, that's procedure. He told detectives he had been there, then left. He portrayed the night as uneventful. No argument, no threats, nothing that would explain why the mother of two would be gone by morning. His statement was placed alongside everyone else's: family, neighbors, anyone who might have seen movement in or out of that unit late at night. The job in those early days was simple: either find a credible scenario where she left by choice, or start treating the scene as the starting point of a crime. To test his account and everyone else's, investigators moved beyond talk. They began pulling what they could: call records, message history, basic digital footprints. They were not looking for sensational secrets. They were checking for life after the moment she was last seen: any outgoing calls, any texts, any social media activity, any use of her accounts. In legitimate walkaway cases, phones light up somewhere, cards get used, profiles stay active. In this case, the pattern cut off. No verified communications from her after that night. No bank activity that supported a new start. Silence. That silence, paired with the conditions inside the apartment, was more than a feeling. It was an evidentiary shift. It undercut the idea that she had stepped out to cool off, meet someone, or travel without notice. Detectives now had a young mother with deep ties to her kids, a narrow disappearance window, no forced entry, no credible sightings, and no digital or financial trail. As the days turned into weeks, the suspect pool tightened the way it does in real work. Stranger abduction from a locked residence with sleeping children and no disturbance ranked low on the probability scale. The people closest to Unique, including the fathers of her children, were examined and compared against records and timelines. Alibis were checked, cross-checked, and either held or cracked. The circle of realistic scenarios got smaller. There was one constant: the man who had been in that apartment shortly before she vanished occupied a different category than the rest. His presence was tied directly to that specific night. His statement was measured against phone logs, movements, and what little was known about his history. At that stage, detectives could not call him a killer. But they could not, in good faith, set aside the fact that he was the only outside adult confirmed inside a private space from which a woman disappeared with surgical silence. For viewers who follow real cases, this is where the story takes on a different weight. You see the difference between a missing person report that fades and an investigation that starts to harden into a homicide file, even without a body. The work is slow, repetitive by design, and built on checks, not guesses. Behind every step is a simple human truth: when someone like Unique drops out of contact overnight, it is usually not because she chose to stop being a mother, it is because someone took that choice away. In the weeks after the disappearance, the file did what serious files do: it grew. Statements, call logs, tip sheets, search reports. Detectives pulled what they could from that first window: who was in the apartment, who called, who knocked, who was seen in the hallway. They pushed hard early, because experience says if you don't move in those first days, you spend years trying to make up ground you already lost. Still, there was no confirmed sighting of Unique Harris after that night. No verified phone use. No bank activity that suggested travel, a new address, or a hidden life. The routine checks that sometimes bring relief, an arrest in another state, a hospital intake, a social media footprint, never came. Behind the scenes, investigators did what they could with what they had. The truth was simple and difficult at the same time: there was no proof of life, and no body. What held the case in motion was not a dramatic new clue but consistency. The same profile was repeated by family, friends, and records. Harris was tied to her children, tied to her mother, and in the middle of building a stable foundation. When you map cases across the country, that pattern matters. People already living on the edge of disappearance leave erratic trails. She did not. That contrast is one of the reasons the file did not get quietly buried as just another young black woman who might have run off. It stayed active, even when the leads cooled. As months turned into years, the work shifted from search operations to retention and review. Detectives rotated, the file did not. Evidence from the apartment was logged and preserved. Notes from the early interviews were there to be read again, side by side instead of in isolation. The disappearance window was locked down. The list of people with genuine access to that space stayed short. Out in public, the case looked stuck. Inside the squad rooms, the same name kept circling back. By 2018, the passage of time forced a legal step that no family wants but that sometimes becomes unavoidable. A D.C. Superior Court judge granted a petition to presume Unique Harris dead. A death certificate was issued. It did not solve anything. It did not explain what was done to her or where she was. What it did, in practical terms, was align the legal system with what the evidence had been quietly saying for years: she did not walk away and start over. Something criminal happened in that apartment, even if the full mechanism was still off the page. From an investigative standpoint, that ruling mattered. It confirmed this as more than a missing adult who might resurface. It framed the case as a homicide without a body, and it justified a deeper, more aggressive look at the person or people who had opportunity and proximity that night. No one pushed a reset button. Instead, the same facts were put back on the table under a sharper light. This is the part of a nobody case that rarely makes headlines but often decides outcomes. Cold does not always mean forgotten. It means the standard missing person moves have been exhausted, and any progress will come from patience and from going back over old ground with better context. Files like this survive because someone refuses to treat a young mother's disappearance as background noise, family on the outside, and one or two people on the inside of the system who won't let it slide off their desk. For many viewers, these long stretches feel empty. Nothing happens. But in real investigations, this is where weak theories die. Nobody credible comes forward to place Harris alive. No document surfaces to support a new life somewhere else. The person who had been inside that apartment remains in the record, his story unchanged, his explanations no stronger. The silence around everyone else begins to look less like uncertainty and more like exclusion. By the time the case approached its 10th year, the question inside the department was no longer whether something had happened to Unique Harris. That question had been answered by time, behavior, and absence. The question that stayed open was narrower and harder. Could they turn a pattern of opportunity, prior conduct, preserved evidence, and contradictions into a chargeable, provable homicide case without ever bringing her home? The turn in this case did not come from a new witness or a dramatic confession. It came from going back to something that had been there since day one, the damaged couch. Years after Unique Harris disappeared from her apartment in Southeast D.C., a new detective assigned to the cold case sat with the evidence list and the interview transcripts lined up side by side. One detail kept repeating in those early statements: the man who had visited that night minimized his connection to her. He shifted his story about how well he knew her, whether he stayed, what their relationship was. On paper, it looked casual. But that version now had to stand against preserved physical evidence. The cushion from Unique's couch had been stored, documented, and kept. When it was examined with fresh attention, testing confirmed what the early scene suggested: a deliberate cut had been made, material removed. The question was why. When forensic work identified that the remaining fabric held that visitor's DNA, the answer started to come into focus. It was not about proving a consensual encounter, it was about exposing a lie. He had denied certain contact. The couch said otherwise. For an investigator, that mismatch is critical. In a nobody case, you rarely get one perfect piece of proof. You get a pattern, someone close to the victim, present at the right time, who cannot keep their story straight when checked against evidence. Here, the physical object in the living room directly contradicted the narrative that this man had tried to build for years, that he was just another person who had stopped by and left before anything happened. Then another layer was brought in, one that had never gone away but had not been fully leveraged: location data. At the time of Unique Harris's disappearance, that same man was under court-ordered electronic monitoring. Those records, once pulled and read precisely against the timeline of the night, showed him in and around her apartment building throughout the critical hours. Not passing by. Not briefly visiting. Present overnight. The combination is what mattered. His own words had moved over time, denying he had seen her that day, denying intimacy, downplaying his presence. The data did not move. The GPS records placed him there. The calls between his phone and hers that evening were documented. The DNA tied him to the piece of furniture someone had tried to alter. When you overlay those points on top of a disappearance carried out without forced entry, in a locked space, with no trace of the victim afterward, the pool of explanations gets very small. This was not speculation about a stranger or a shadowy figure slipping through a window. This was a named, known adult with verified contact, verified access, and verified deception. That is the kind of convergence cold case detectives wait for. It does not solve every question, how, where, what sequence, but it establishes one thing with weight: the person who kept insisting he was on the edges of this story was, in fact, standing in the center of it. Around this time, additional information reinforced that conclusion. Prior reports outlined a history of violence in this man's background, the kind of history courts allow into a homicide trial to show pattern when carefully tested and admitted. That history did not by itself prove what happened to Unique, but it made his presence in her last known hours more concerning, not less. Taken together, the file was no longer only about a missing mother. It was about whether they had enough to bring a no-body murder charge against the one individual whose actions, movements, and statements consistently conflicted with the facts. For the family, these developments were both painful and necessary. They had been saying for years that their daughter did not run. The evidence now backed that belief in clear, procedural terms. For viewers following this case, this is the moment the narrative stops feeling like an open question. The science, the records, and the contradictions are pointing in one direction. In responsible storytelling, that direction is not hype, it is a demonstration of how quiet, documented details can carry more weight than any dramatic monologue. The legal challenge remained, transforming those aligned facts into a charge that could survive in court. A prosecutor considering this file has to ask, if we put this in front of a jury, with no body, no confession, is this enough? The GPS trail that keeps him at the scene. The DNA on the couch he tried to distance himself from. The persistent lies about his relationship with Unique and about being in her home that night. The years of silence from her side. All happening in one small apartment in Washington, D.C., on one specific night in October 2010. That is not word soup. That is a straight line. By the time a decade had passed, this was no longer a missing person file in any honest sense. Inside the case documents, the pattern around one man was fixed. He was at Unique Harris's apartment the night she vanished. His DNA was on the mutilated couch. His movements were logged at the scene through the hours when she disappeared, and his own statements shifted every time detectives pressed him. The question for law enforcement became very direct. Were they willing to stand in front of a jury with no body and argue that this was murder, and that he was the one who did it? That kind of decision is not made off a headline or a hunch. Prosecutors and detectives sat on the same set of facts the audience has now watched build across this story. A young mother disappears from a controlled environment in Southeast D.C. with her children asleep in the next room. No credible trace of her life after that night. A visitor with a documented history of violence toward women is present. GPS records, from his own court-ordered monitoring, quietly anchor him to her building through the critical window. Forensic analysis links him physically to the one object in the apartment that someone tried to alter. Over multiple interviews, he denies what the evidence later shows to be true, denies staying, denies intimacy, denies even seeing her that day before walking parts of those statements back when confronted. Individually, each point might be explained away. Together, they formed what homicide units recognize as a chargeable narrative. In a no-body case, the law does not demand a perfect picture. It demands that the state can show, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the victim is dead, that she died by criminal act, and that the defendant is responsible. Here, the absence of Unique's body was not a hole in the story. It was consistent with what prosecutors argued he chose to do, remove her remains so thoroughly that her children, her mother, and the system would be left with questions instead of a scene. For the family, the years of waiting had produced one constant: they believed he was responsible. That belief alone could never be the basis for an arrest. What changed, and what finally matched their conviction with the standard of proof, was the alignment of hard evidence. The GPS data that had always been there, now fully charted. The DNA on the couch, tested and interpreted in the context of his denials. Testimony that he had made remarks implying that she would never be found and that he had done it right, language that, in a courtroom, would sound less like bravado and more like consciousness of guilt. In late 2020, 10 years after Unique disappeared, that alignment crossed the line from suspicion to action. Detectives secured a warrant. The man who had been hovering on the edge of the narrative since the first night was now brought to the center of it in handcuffs. The charge was second-degree murder while armed in connection with the October 2010 disappearance of Unique Harris. It was a public statement of what the file had been building quietly for years. The District of Columbia was prepared to say, in court, that she was dead, that this was a homicide, and that they could prove he was the one who made her vanish. From a casework perspective, that arrest did more than check a box. It locked in the theory. There would be no second suspect, no sudden pivot to an unknown intruder. The government committed to one story. In that apartment, on that night, a man with a violent past exploited access and opportunity, killed a 24-year-old mother, and disposed of her body so completely that only digital traces and preserved forensic samples were left to speak for her. That is the core of a nobody prosecution. It is not flashy. It is careful. For audiences who study these cases, there's an important point here. This is what it looks like when a system listens to a family but does not stop at emotion, when it takes seriously the risk patterns women face with men who already have proven records of harm, and when it is willing to trust cumulative evidence even without the one thing everyone wishes they had, a place to lay her to rest. It is also a reminder that nobody cases are not guesses dressed up as justice. They are built, line by line, until not moving forward would be the greater failure. When this case finally went in front of a jury in Washington, D.C., it arrived without the one element most people still associate with a murder trial: a body. No remains. No autopsy. No formal medical cause of death. What the panel received instead was a structured, documented chain of facts that started in a small apartment in October 2010 and pointed, step by step, to one man. The government's presentation was straightforward. They began with what was no longer in dispute. At 24 years old, Unique Harris vanished overnight from her Hartford Street SE apartment, leaving behind her children, her identification, and the life she had been actively building. For more than a decade, there was no confirmed sign of her, no financial activity, no verified contact, no credible sighting. The jury was told plainly, if she were alive, the systems that track ordinary life would have seen her. They did not. From there, prosecutors shifted the focus where the investigation had already settled, onto Isaac Moy. Jurors saw the monitoring records that placed him at Unique's building during the critical hours. This was not a passing visit. The data showed his presence overlapping the window in which she was last known to be alive and her unexplained disappearance. That alone did not prove murder, but it destroyed any claim that he had briefly stopped by and left her safe. Then came the physical evidence. Forensic testimony confirmed that Moy's DNA was found on the torn area of Unique's couch. The importance was twofold. It linked him directly to a manipulated object inside her home, and it undercut his earlier denials about the nature and extent of his contact with her. The jurors were not asked to speculate wildly. They were shown that each time Moy had been confronted with a verifiable record, location data, forensic results, his story bent to fit the new information instead of matching it from the beginning. The prosecution also, within the boundaries allowed by the court, introduced evidence of his prior violent conduct toward women. It was not presented as character assassination. It went to pattern, how he treated intimate partners, how he responded to conflict, what he was capable of behind closed doors. Combined with testimony about statements he made implying that Unique would never be found, it painted a picture of someone who understood the consequences of making a person disappear and was willing to reference it. The defense strategy centered on the missing body. They pressed the idea that without remains, there could be no certainty about what happened, no confirmed mechanism of death, and no direct witness to an assault. They suggested that DNA on a couch might reflect consensual contact, that the years between 2010 and trial could blur memories or create gaps. Their message was clear: the evidence might raise suspicion, but suspicion was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In a nobody case, the outcome often turns on whether jurors see scattered points or a continuous line. Here, that line held. Unique's complete disappearance from every aspect of normal life, the confined setting, Moy's exclusive opportunity, his documented presence through court-ordered monitoring, his DNA on altered furniture in her home, his inconsistent statements, and his history of violence all converged. There was no alternate suspect with similar access, no competing theory supported by evidence. When deliberations ended, the verdict matched the story the evidence told. The jury found Isaac Moy guilty of second-degree murder for the killing of Unique Harris. It was an acknowledgement that the absence of her body was not a loophole, it was part of the method used against her. The court treated that absence not as doubt, but as one more fact consistent with his actions. When the verdict came back guilty, there was one step left, turning legal responsibility into a concrete sentence. In September 2023, inside a D.C. courtroom, the judge imposed 35 years in prison on Isaac Moy for the second-degree murder of Unique Harris, followed by supervised release. It was the formal endpoint of a case that started with a missing person report and ended as a no-body homicide conviction, built on access, digital tracking, forensic confirmation, and his own shifting statements. That sentence did not appear out of nowhere. By the time it was handed down, the story the evidence told was stable. A 24-year-old mother vanished from her own apartment on October 10, 2010. Her identification and glasses stayed behind. Her phone and keys went with whoever left that unit. Her body was never recovered. Only one man, already under court supervision, was proven to be there through that crucial night. His DNA was on the altered couch. His account changed as each new fact surfaced. No one else in her life fit that pattern. At sentencing, the focus turned briefly from analysis to impact. For her family, this was not a perfect resolution. There was no gravesite to visit, no answer to the basic question of where she is. But there was recognition. The court said, on the record, that what happened to Unique Harris was not a disappearance into rumor, it was a crime, committed by a specific person, in a specific place, proven to the standard the law demands. For the system, this case underlines a difficult truth: some offenders count on no body, no case. Here, that logic failed. Preserved evidence, long-term digital records, and consistent investigative pressure closed the gap he tried to create. It shows other families in similar situations that a lack of recovered remains does not automatically mean no one can ever be held accountable. For everyone watching from the outside, there are quieter lessons. Violence in this story did not come from a stranger in an alley. It came through access that looked casual and familiar. It reminds us how often victims, especially young black women, are dismissed as having run off when the evidence says otherwise. It shows why it matters when detectives, prosecutors, and communities refuse to let those files fade out. What remains unresolved is honest and should not be hidden. As of now, Unique has not been found. That absence is part of the harm. But it does not split this into two stories. There is one narrative here: a mother taken from her children, a case that went cold, a build-up of evidence, an arrest, a trial, and a single, lawful outcome. We close this case with that clarity. One victim, Unique Harris. One convicted offender, Isaac Moy. One jurisdiction, Washington, D.C., United States. No alternate endings. No second version. Just the record, and a reminder that telling it straight is one way to honor the person whose voice isn't here to correct us. After walking through Unique Harris's case with you, I'm reminded that real safety starts with noticing who we let close, speaking up when something feels off, and refusing to let any victim become a statistic. Her story is proof that persistence matters. Now I'd like to hear from you. What did this case say to you, and where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want more true cases told straight, with respect and no dramatized nonsense, hit subscribe and stay with us at C Crime Stories.